The 13th reading. Deep in the Louisiana bayou, where the cypress trees stood like silent sentinels and the air hung heavy with mist, there was a small town called Étoile Noire. Known for its ghost stories and cursed lineage, the town was home to a peculiar old woman named Madame Lucille, a tarot reader whose reputation stretched far beyond the swamp. Her cards, they said, were unlike any other. They didn't just show the future, they shaped it. Madame Lucille lived in a crumbling shack perched above the water. The only way to reach her was by boat, and even then most dared not go after dark. Locals whispered of strange lights in the windows and shadowy figures moving inside when no one was there. But despite the rumours, people came. When desperation outweighed fear, they sought her out. One humid evening, a young man named Julien Dupree rowed his small boat through the dark bayou, following the narrow path to Lucille's shack. The air was thick with the scent of rot and earth, and the only sounds were the gentle lap of water against the boat and the occasional croak of frogs. Julien was gaunt, his cheeks hollow and his eyes sunken with exhaustion. He had tried everything, priests, healers, and doctors, but nothing could explain what was happening to his family. His wife, Odette, had fallen ill 3 months ago, wasting away with no apparent cause. Then came the dreams, terrifying visions of shadowy figures, whispering his name, beckoning him into the swamp. The shack loomed ahead, its crooked silhouette barely visible through the mist. A single lantern burned in the window, casting an eerie glow. Julien hesitated, gripping the oars tightly. He didn't believe in spirits or curses, but he had no other options. Madame Lucille opened the door before Julien could knock. She was shorter than he expected, her frame thin but steady, with piercing grey eyes that seemed to look straight through him. Her hair was a wild tangle of silver, and she wore a faded shawl embroidered with symbols Julien didn't recognise. "You've come far," Lucille said, her voice raspy yet melodic, "and your burden is heavy." Julien nodded, his throat dry. "It's my wife. She's dying, and I've been having dreams. Horrible dreams. I don't know what they mean." Lucille stepped aside, gesturing for him to enter. The shack smelled of herbs and something metallic, and every surface was cluttered with jars, bones, and bundles of dried plants. In the centre of the room was a small table, a worn tarot deck resting in the middle. "Sit," Lucille commanded. Julien obeyed, sinking into a creaky chair as she lit a few candles, their flickering light casting shadows that danced across the walls. "The cards will tell you what you seek," Lucille said, sitting across from him. "But once they speak, there is no turning back." "I don't care," Julien said. "I need answers." Lucille nodded and began to shuffle the cards. The deck moved in her hands like a living thing, the edges frayed but pulsing with energy. She laid out 3 cards one by one, with deliberate care. The first card was the moon, its pale glow illuminating a winding path. Julien felt a chill run down his spine. "The moon speaks of deception," Lucille said. "A truth hidden in shadows. What you see is not all that is." The second card was the tower, its fiery spire crumbling as figures fell into the abyss. Julien's breath hitched. "The tower is destruction," Lucille continued. "Something has been undone, and its consequences are upon you." The third card was death. Julien's heart pounded as he stared at the skeletal figure cloaked in black, holding its scythe. "Death is not always an ending," Lucille said softly. "But in your case, it is." Julien shook his head, his hands trembling. "Number that doesn't make sense. Is it my wife? Is she—" Lucille hesitated, her eyes narrowing as she reached for the deck. "There is one more card," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But it doesn't always reveal itself." She shuffled again, and as the cards moved, Julien swore he heard a faint whispering, as if the deck was speaking. Lucille's hands stilled, and she drew a card from the middle of the deck. Her face paled as she turned it over. It was a card Julien had never seen before. A black card, its surface glossy and smooth, showing only a pair of hollow, glowing eyes. At the bottom, in faint, curling script, was the number 13, though it was unlike the death card. Lucille's breath caught. "The 13th card," she said, her voice trembling. "It doesn't belong in the deck, it only appears when—" "When what?" Julian demanded. "When the spirits of the bayou claim their own?" The air in the shack grew colder, and the shadows on the walls seemed to lengthen, stretching toward Julian. The candles flickered wildly before extinguishing, plunging the room into darkness. Julian's chest tightened as a low, guttural voice echoed through the room. "You summoned us," the voice rasped. Part 2. The 13th card returns. The whispers returned on the first anniversary of Julian's disappearance. Odette, now strong and vibrant, tended to her small garden when the breeze carried a familiar voice. "Odette!" She froze, her breath catching. It was Julian's voice, faint but unmistakable. "Julian," she whispered, her heart racing. The garden grew silent, the air heavy with anticipation. That night the dreams began. Odette saw Julian, his figure wreathed in shadows standing at the edge of the bayou. His eyes were no longer the warm, kind ones she knew. They burned like embers, filled with something otherworldly. "They need me to deliver a warning," Julian said in her dream. "The curse is not over." Odette woke drenched in sweat, clutching her locket with Julian's picture inside. The following day, a stranger arrived in the village, a tall man in a long coat with a weathered face. He introduced himself as Beau Leclerc, a folklorist and historian who had come to study the legends of the bayou. "You're the widow of Julien Duval?" he asked, his tone cautious. "I am," Odette replied, her voice guarded. "I've heard the stories about the 13th card and your husband," Beau said. "But there's more to the legend than what people know. The pact your husband tried to fulfill wasn't broken, it was rewritten. The spirits demand balance and they won't stop until they have it." Odette's blood ran cold. "What do you mean?" Beau hesitated, glancing around as if the shadows were listening. "The spirits will come for another. Someone bound by the same bloodline. If we don't stop them, this cycle will never end." A crash of thunder shook the house, though the sky was clear. The candles flickered wildly and a low whisper slithered through the air. "Odette!" Her eyes widened. "Julian?" The whisper turned into a guttural growl. "Stay away from the cards. You'll only make it worse." But it was too late. Beau reached into his coat and pulled out a weathered deck, the 13th card glowing faintly at the top. "They've already chosen," Beau said grimly, "and they're coming tonight." The bayou came alive with sounds, branches cracking, water lapping ominously, and the unmistakable hiss of whispers rising from the swamp. Odette and Beau barricaded the doors and windows, the small cabin trembling as the spirits closed in. Lucille appeared at the edge of the property, her eyes hollow, her lips moving in silent prayer. "You summoned them again," Lucille said, stepping inside uninvited. "But this time, the stakes are higher." Before anyone could question her, the shadows poured into the room like ink spilling across the floor. The towering figure returned, its ember eyes blazing. "The Duval line owes us," it rasped. "The debt must be paid." Odette stood firm, her voice steady. "Then take me. End this once and for all." The figure paused, tilting its head. "Brave, but not enough." Julian's voice echoed through the room, distant and pained. "Odette, no!" Beau stepped forward, holding the deck aloft. "What if I end it for all of us? A final gamble. One last draw." The figure laughed, a sound like shattering glass. "Do you think yourself worthy, mortal?" "Very well." Beau's hands shook as he drew a card. The room fell silent as he flipped it over. The tower. A violent force exploded outward, throwing everyone to the ground. The shadow figure screamed, its form fracturing, its ember eyes dimming. When the dust settled, the cabin was in ruins, but the oppressive weight had lifted. Beau gasped for breath, the deck of cards now dull and lifeless in his hands. Lucille knelt by Odette, who stared at the horizon, tears streaming down her face. "Is it over?" Odette whispered. Beau nodded. "For now. But curses like this, they have roots deeper than we can see. Be vigilant." As dawn broke, a faint whisper drifted through the bayou once more. "Odette, I'm still here." Julian's voice was soft, almost peaceful. She clutched her locket tightly, her heart heavy yet hopeful. The spirits were gone, but their story remained, a warning etched into the soul of the bayou, carried by the wind and the whispers of the 13th card.
The fortune teller's tent sat at the edge of the carnival, shrouded in mist and the faint scent of damp earth. Clara had ignored it all evening, avoiding the strange, flickering light spilling from within. But as the night wore on, curiosity overtook her. She pushed through the heavy velvet curtain. Inside, the air felt thick and heavy. A hunched woman sat behind a table draped in crimson cloth, her gnarled hands resting on a deck of worn tarot cards. "You've come to know your fate," the woman rasped, her voice a blend of gravel and smoke. Clara hesitated. "I thought this was just for fun." The woman's mouth curled into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "The cards are never fun, my dear. Sit." Against her better judgment, Clara obeyed, her stomach twisting in knots. The woman shuffled the deck, her movements unnervingly fluid for someone so old. She laid out 3 cards face down in front of Clara. "The past, the present, the future," she murmured. "Are you ready?" Clara nodded, her pulse quickening. The first card was flipped, a simple depiction of a house engulfed in flames. "The tower," the fortune teller said. "A foundation shattered, a painful upheaval. You've already felt its sting." Clara thought of her family's home burning to the ground 2 months ago, leaving her with nothing but ash and grief. She swallowed hard but said nothing. The second card revealed a figure cloaked in black, holding a scythe. "Death," the woman said. "Not the end, but transformation. You stand on the precipice of change. But beware, this change comes at a cost." Clara's palms began to sweat. "What does that mean?" The woman ignored her question, flipping the final card. Clara's breath caught. The image on the card was grotesque. A horned figure crouched atop a throne of bones, chains wrapped around its talon-like fingers. "The devil," the woman whispered, her voice almost reverent. "Temptation, obsession, a deal that cannot be undone." The air in the tent seemed to grow colder. Clara felt a pull in her chest, as if the card itself were reaching for her. "I don't want to know anymore," Clara said, her voice trembling. But the woman leaned forward, her eyes burning with an unnatural light. "It's not about what you want. The cards have spoken." Suddenly, the tent around them dissolved, the carnival sounds fading into a deafening silence. Clara found herself sitting in a dark, endless void. The table and the fortune teller were gone, but the cards remained, hovering in the air before her. "What is this?" Clara cried, her voice echoing. A deep, guttural laugh rumbled from the darkness. The devil card began to glow, its surface rippling like liquid. From it emerged a figure, tall, horned, and wreathed in smoke. Its eyes glowed red, pinning Clara in place. "You've summoned me," it growled, its voice resonating in her bones. "No, I didn't," Clara protested, scrambling backward. The devil's grin was wide and sharp. "Your fate was sealed the moment you entered that tent. The cards are not mere paper, child. They are a door." Clara's mind raced, her heart pounding. "What do you want from me?" The devil reached out, a clawed finger tracing the air. "A simple trade. Power, wealth, anything your heart desires, in exchange for a piece of you." Clara shook her head violently. "No, I didn't ask for this." The devil tilted its head. "Yet here you are. Refuse, and the void will claim you. Accept, and your wildest dreams will come true." The shadows around Clara began to close in, cold and suffocating. Her survival instincts kicked in. "Fine," she shouted. "I'll do it." The devil's laughter echoed again. "Good." It extended its hand and Clara hesitated before placing hers in its icy grip. Pain shot through her, as if something vital had been ripped away. When she opened her eyes, she was back in the fortune teller's tent. The woman was gone, and the cards lay face down on the table. Clara's hand throbbed. She looked down and saw a small mark, a faint, burning sigil in the shape of the devil card. As she stumbled out into the cool night air, the carnival seemed unchanged. People laughed, lights sparkled, and music played. But something was wrong. The world felt thinner. A man bumped into her, muttering an apology. But when she looked up, his face was empty, just smooth, featureless skin. Clara turned in horror. The crowd was full of them, faceless figures, all moving as if nothing were amiss. The devil's voice whispered in her ear, soft and mocking. Welcome to your new reality, Clara. You have everything you ever wanted. Now,
Title: The Cards of the Saint Father. Elias had been the priest at St. Thomas Church for over 20 years, known for his deep faith and unwavering commitment to the Roman Catholic faith. But recently, something had been unsettling him. An old, weathered deck of tarot cards had surfaced in the church's library. It wasn't the first time something strange had happened at St. Thomas, but this felt different. The cards were tucked inside a forgotten box of relics, hidden behind the altar. It seemed out of place. Its faded illustrations of mysterious symbols and figures starkly contrasted the holy relics surrounding it. Curious but cautious, Father Elias set the deck aside, convinced it was nothing more than a relic of pagan superstition that had somehow found its way into the church. That night, as the moonlight streamed through the church's stained glass windows, Father Elias sat alone in the rectory, praying, but the prayers felt hollow, like they were being swallowed by something dark in the shadows. When he finished, he went to his desk to find a letter, sealed with an unfamiliar insignia, an image of a saint, surrounded by swirling symbols, very much like the ones on the tarot cards. The letter was written in elegant script. The cards you possess will reveal truths beyond the veil. If you do not heed them, they will take what is sacred. Father Elias' blood ran cold. He had heard rumors of cursed artifacts in the church, items left behind by those who dabbled in the occult, but he never imagined it would come to him. The note warned him. The cards could not be destroyed. He knew he had to act quickly. The next morning, Father Elias performed a ritual cleansing of the church, asking the Lord to shield his sanctuary from darkness. But when he opened the box containing the tarot cards, they had been rearranged. The cards were no longer in their original order. Instead, 3 cards lay face up in front of him, their images more vivid than ever. The Fool. A young man stood on a cliff, his eyes wide with wonder. But just beneath his feet, there was a dark abyss. The Tower. A stone cathedral stood in flames, with figures falling from the crumbling towers. The sky was black with swirling clouds. The Devil. A grotesque demon with twisted horns and red eyes, holding chains, bound to a dark figure at his feet. Father Elias felt a chill run through his spine. These weren't just any tarot cards. They were speaking to him, showing him visions of impending doom. That night, unable to sleep, he returned to the church. The air inside felt thick, heavy with something that wasn't right. As he walked through the pews, he heard soft murmurs, whispers of ancient prayers in a language he couldn't understand. The candles flickered, casting long shadows across the stone floors. Then, a figure appeared at the altar. It was a man, draped in tattered robes. His face was hidden by a hood, but there was an unmistakable aura of darkness surrounding him. He reached out a hand, pointing directly at Father Elias, and in a voice that sent shivers down his spine, he spoke. "The cards have chosen you, Father. They will reveal your fate. You cannot escape." Father Elias dropped to his knees, praying desperately for divine intervention. But as the figure stepped forward, the tarot cards flew from their box, swirling around him like leaves caught in a storm. Each card seemed to pulse with dark energy. Then, just as quickly as it had begun, the figure vanished, and the cards settled on the ground. Father Elias was left alone, but the weight of the presence lingered. Shaken, he gathered the cards and took them to the church's confessional, hoping that a blessing might rid the curse. But as he placed them on the altar, he saw something that made his blood run cold. The cards had changed. The Fool now had a face. The face of Father Elias standing on the edge of the cliff, his expression one of naive certainty. The tower now depicted St. Thomas Church, flames engulfing the altar, with Father Elias falling amidst the burning rubble. And the devil now grinned from the center of the card, his hands wrapped tightly around chains that led to Father Elias's wrists. The tarot cards had foretold his demise, his sacred life, his faith. Everything would burn unless he embraced the darkness. The next morning, the town awoke to the tragic news. Father Elias had vanished without a trace. The church was left abandoned, with only the tarot cards remaining on the altar. But if you stand before the doors of St. Thomas Church, you might hear whispers in the wind, a prayer being spoken in an ancient tongue, and the sound of chains rattling in the distance. And the tarot cards, they wait for the next priest, the next soul to claim.
Title: The Whispering House. It was a cold, moonless night when Claire and her husband Derek moved into the old house on Ashwood Lane. The property was cheap, nestled in the woods, far from town, and had been vacant for years. Claire, excited about their new life, didn't mind the odd creaks and groans that came with an old house. But Derek, always the skeptic, grew uneasy with every passing night. On the third evening, Claire noticed the strange whispers. They started softly at first, like a faint breeze, but as the night deepened, they grew clearer, until they became distinct words. They seemed to come from the walls. "Claire!" She froze, heart pounding. The voice sounded like hers. She called out, "Derek?" He came running into the room, but heard nothing. "It's just the house settling. Let's go to bed." But that night, the whispers grew louder. They came from every corner of the house, almost like an echo bouncing off the walls. And this time, Claire was sure. One of the whispers wasn't just calling her name. It was saying something else. "Claire, come closer." The next night, Claire couldn't sleep. She walked the house, desperate to understand where the voice was coming from. As she passed the hallway mirror, she caught a glimpse of something in the reflection. A shadowy figure, tall and distorted, standing just behind her. She whipped around, but the hallway was empty. Her pulse quickened, her breath shallow. "Derek!" she screamed. But when he came to her, the figure had vanished. He was starting to get frustrated with her growing paranoia. But deep down, he could feel it too. There was something wrong with the house. The following day, Claire discovered the house's dark past. A former owner had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only strange drawings, symbols, and unfinished rituals. The whispers were tied to something far older than the house itself. A curse. That night, the whispers returned, stronger than before, filling the entire house with an eerie presence. As Claire lay in bed, the voice grew louder, coming closer. "Claire, come find me." Her heart raced as the room temperature dropped. Something cold brushed against her cheek. She turned her head slowly, and there, in the dark corner of the room, stood the figure. A pale, gaunt face with hollow eyes stared at her. The figure reached out a trembling hand, beckoning her. With a scream, Claire bolted from the room, rushing down the hallway. But the house had changed. The walls seemed to shift, closing in on her. She couldn't find the exit. Panicking, she tried to reach Derek, but he was nowhere to be found. She ran breathless until she stumbled into the living room where a figure stood in front of the fireplace, Derek, or what was left of him. His eyes were wide open, but lifeless. The same gaunt features she had seen earlier now mirrored on his face. She backed away, her body trembling in terror. The figure in front of her smiled, a twisted grin spreading across its face. "You should have listened, Claire," it whispered in Derek's voice. And then the walls collapsed, plunging her into darkness. The next morning, the house stood silent, the whispers gone. But in the reflection of the mirror, a new face stared back. Claire's. Her eyes were hollow, a twisted grin playing on her lips. And the house, once again, was ready for the next unsuspecting soul to move in.